From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A week ago, the Ukrainian military rolled over its northern border and launched a surprise attack on Russian territory. Vladimir Putin appears to have been entirely unprepared, and the Ukrainians are now holding about 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory. More than 100,000 Russian civilians have fled. Is this an inflection point in Ukraine's war against Vladimir Putin? Later, we'll talk about the child tax credit that J.D. Vance proposed of $5,000 per child. Is this a substantive good idea that will help Americans have more children? And what does Trump think about the idea? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kate Batchelder Odell. I'm here with my colleague Jillian Melcher in Europe, who is here to help us understand how to think about the Ukrainian incursion into Russia. So, Jillian, let's start at the top. We're going to listen to what U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina had to say after a bipartisan meeting with Zelensky about what's going on in Russia.
They were predicting in Washington that Kyiv would fall in 4 days, the whole country would fall in 3 weeks. Well, they were wrong. And here we are all these months, years later, your people are suffering, they're resilient, and you're in Russia. Bold and brilliant. Taking this war to Putin and make him understand and pay a price is the right thing. So I'm hoping that in 2024, you'll get more military aid from the Congress. We're going to have a new president next year. I think there's a case to be made that is in our national security interest with your Republican and Democrat for Ukraine to survive and thrive.
Bold and brilliant is how Senator Graham summed up Ukraine's incursion into Russia. Jillian, why don't you start us off by laying out here, what have the Ukrainians accomplished over this past week? What are they aiming to do by taking this much Russian territory?
So I should start with the caveat that Ukrainians are being extraordinarily tight-lipped about this operation. They don't want to do anything to jeopardize it, and they want to keep the Russians guessing. And I think that unpredictability has really worked in their favor. I mean, you've got Vladimir Putin since the start of his full-scale invasion, really anticipating that he could enjoy a sanctuary in Russia, that he could strike Ukraine, strike its civilians and civilian infrastructure and terrorize them. And then nothing would happen on Russian territory, that they'd be completely safe. And I think what we've seen in the last week really challenges that assumption. The scope is pretty fluid of what's going on in Kursk right now. That is the oblast to the north of Ukraine near Sumy. And basically, I mean, if you look at what Russian officials, Kursk Oblast governor said Monday that Ukrainian forces have seized 28 settlements, advanced about 12 kilometers deep along a 40-kilometer front. Then you've got Ukraine's top general saying Ukraine controls about 1,000 square kilometers of territory. It's unclear whether or not Ukraine is going to try to hold on to what it's been able to take so far, but it is bringing this war to Russian territory and to Russia. And from what I've been hearing from my sources, Ukraine seems to have devoted very well-trained, experienced troops to this effort. You've also got to keep in mind Alexander Syrsky, that's the top general of Ukraine. He was the mastermind of the 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive that also just totally blindsided the Russians and had them unprepared. And I think what Ukraine is capitalizing on right now is Putin had that assumption of safety on Russian territory. And so that entire spot was very poorly defended. You didn't see good defensive fortifications. You had a lot of very inexperienced conscripts there. A source I've been in touch with was saying he's heard reports of 10 Ukrainian soldiers being able to take prisoner 40 Russians. And you see the same sort of chaos, lack of communication that has enabled these gains. I think it's caught Russia by surprise, and we'll see where this goes.
Right. I mean, I think your sanctuary point can't be underlined enough. It really is an indictment to some extent, even of how the United States has handled the war and its policy in Ukraine. Because if you look, to your point, at how quickly the Ukrainians were able to roll in and take territory, how poorly defended, how few barriers they even ran into. I mean, the war has been going on for over 2 years. And we know from the counteroffensive that Ukraine tried to launch that Russia does have a formidable ability to build in defenses when it wants to. But Vladimir Putin clearly decided that he didn't need to defend this territory. And I think the only reason for that is quite clear, which is that he has been blackmailing the West by saying, don't do anything that will upset me or expand certain certain types of weapons to Ukraine or, using his nuclear arsenal as blackmail on the West. And there is some extent to which he thought that was a gamble that would work, and it did work for a long time. So I think it is impressive that the Ukrainians managed to catch them so off guard. But Jillian, why don't you walk us through, obviously, the goal, as you said, is to take this battle and make Putin pay more of a price for it, make Russians understand the cost of his special military operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine. So Putin's reaction seems to me, he seems to be sort of suggesting this is not a huge deal, that the Russians will get it under control. How do you read his reaction? How much panic is the Russian dictator doing?
Yeah, Putin claimed that the West is behind this incursion, and he says Ukraine is trying to sow discord and improve its position in any future negotiations. But that's also kind of contradictory to other Kremlin messaging we've heard. Putin really wants the message brought across that Ukraine isn't willing to engage in good faith negotiations. So I think at minimum, one success of this incursion has been to collapse or call into question some of the Kremlin narratives. I mean, we'll be honest here. Ukraine is being very tight-lipped. We don't know what the objectives are of what's going on in Kursk. Ukraine's been really quiet about that. There's been a lot of operational silence. But I think that we can look at some of the benefits that Ukraine could potentially reap. And one of them is Ukraine probably wants to challenge that assumption on the Russian side of a sanctuary. And the practical effect of that is Russia has a 621-mile border with Ukraine. It's assumed for the past 2 years that it doesn't need to strongly defend that. But if all of a sudden it needs to start worrying about Ukrainian incursions anywhere along that front, then that has implications for its allotment of both manpower and weaponry. So part of this could be an effort to get Russia to divert some of its combat power from other parts of the front line. I think this operation has also certainly helped Ukraine seize the initiative in at least one part of the front. It may be stealing Russia's thunder a little bit. In May, Russia launched an offensive targeting Kharkiv nearby, and it's been just pummeling the city, pummeling its civilian infrastructure, its energy infrastructure, using glide bombs to cause a lot of devastation. So it's possible that Ukraine is trying to preempt that, a similar assault on Sumy on the other side of Kursk, and to create a buffer on Russian territory as opposed to Ukrainian territory. And then I just think this really undermines Russia's claims of military inevitability, something that could hurt Russian morale. And potentially, if Ukraine can hold on to some of this land, it might end up being useful in future negotiations. It would give it more leverage to get some of its own land back. And then there are all kinds of secondary benefits with Kursk. I mean, it's got important energy infrastructure that becomes even more vulnerable as a result of this incursion. Kursk is a big point for launching Shahed drones that Russia has used to terrorize civilians in Ukraine. Footage shows that some Russian military vehicles have sustained significant damage there. So I think we've got a lot of sort of carry-on effects that might not be the objective, but might be positive consequences of this incursion.
Thanks, Jillian. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Potomac Watch. Welcome back to Potomac Watch. I'm Kate Batchelder Odell, and I'm chatting with my colleague, Jillian Melcher, about the war in Ukraine. Before the break, Jillian was sketching out some possible objectives of the Ukrainian incursion into Russia, including spreading the Russian defenders thin, diverting more manpower to that part of the front. They may also try to use this land that they now hold as leverage in negotiations as part of ending the war. But Jillian, one thing I want to talk about is how should the West consolidate this momentum that Ukraine has now seized? One of the biggest regrettable things in this war, I think, has been when the West failed to capitalize on arming Ukraine ahead of its counteroffensive, on allowing the Russians a full winter to dig in before Ukraine was really allowed to get on the offensive with its new Western weaponry. So what opportunities are there now for the West? One that comes to mind immediately would be removing the outstanding limits on the Army tactical missile system. That's one of the Army's longest range fires that could penetrate deep into Russian supply lines in other parts of the front. What are some other things here that the West could do to not lose some of this opening to change the war's trajectory so that it can end on terms that are favorable to Ukraine and favorable to the United States?
Yeah, I want to come back for that question to the concept of Russia's sanctuary and how important that's been. And basically what it means is that Russia has a safe place to stage attacks, that it's warehouses that are full of missiles and other weapons that it uses to strike not just Ukrainian military positions, but to terrorize civilians. Putin's pretty confident that those are safe to have in Russia. You know, when you've got Russian planes taking off, flying over, sending glide bombs across, up until pretty recently, that was a significant thing that Russia was using to devastate Ukrainian military positions around Kharkiv with full confidence that Ukraine couldn't strike back. And that's just a completely untenable proposition. So it's not been very long since the U.S. partially lifted that, said Ukraine can hit back a little bit. Still some unclear boundaries in place as to what Ukraine is and is not allowed to do using Western weapons. And I think you've got to completely remove those restrictions, because otherwise Ukraine is trying to fight an enemy that's punching it as hard as it can in the face with one hand tied behind its back on the counterpunch. So that's for sure one thing. I think also just surging in equipment. Ukraine really has a disparity when it comes to manpower. And so it needs that firepower as a force equalizer. And unfortunately, there have been points in this war where it's been both outmanned and outgunned. And I also think this is something that candidates for president can do, both Trump and Kamala Harris, just providing some reassurance and certainty of U.S. commitment. It's very difficult for Ukraine to plan future military operations when it doesn't know whether it's going to have the weaponry it needs to carry them out. So that's something that U.S. backing and U.S. commitment will certainly help it move from a position of strength. And that should be the goal. You know, Ukraine needs to win this, but Russia needs to lose this. There's a huge deterrent effect in that. And I think Putin's betting that he can outlast the West. And I think we need to challenge that assumption. This counteroffensive has challenged his assumption of a sanctuary. Let's challenge his assumption that he can win this war.